Hi guys. I recently got an email from one of you who is dealing with family medical leave and requesting reasonable accommodation at the same time. And it reminded me of some of the things that I had to work out when I was requesting reasonable accommodation in parallel with filing my EEOC claim. And today I want to share some of those lessons. They can apply to whatever specific processes you're trying to work in parallel. And even if you're only working with one process, you can probably use most of the information that I'm going to share with you today. Lesson 1. Avoid mixing policies. A lot of the processes that we employees have to deal with as victims of discrimination do have things in common, like family medical leave and reasonable accommodation. Both of those things can be useful to workers with disabilities. Usually it's the same person helping us deal with both of those things, so there is a tendency to mix the processes. Sometimes that's by design, but whether it is or not, the consequences are always going to come back to us employees. So it's to our benefit to keep track of what parts of the process are governed by what policy, and to try to keep all those things separate as much as possible. It's hard enough to find our way through one unfamiliar process, even when there's a written policy that you can use as a guide. And of course, navigating two processes is even harder. Not only do we have to understand two policies now, but there are opportunities for those two processes to affect each other in unpredictable ways. They can create sticky situations like catch-22s and apparent contradictions. And some of that is unavoidable when you're doing things in parallel. But when your employer starts mixing the processes up and starts doing things like telling you you shouldn't request reasonable accommodation until you've exhausted all your family medical leave, for example. If we don't question that, we're sort of passively buying into a hybrid of those two processes that probably isn't covered by any written policy. No policy means no guide to help us navigate the situation, and no rules to keep your employer from making up the rules as they go along. That's probably not going to work in our favor. As far as I can tell, the Family Medical Leave Act doesn't exclude us from coverage under the ADA, or vice versa. They're two different processes intended to do two different things. The ADA addresses situations where we could work with reasonable accommodation, and the Family Medical Leave Act addresses situations where we can't work. Lots of us need both of those things. So if you see your employer start to mix processes or smear them together, it's fair to ask questions to determine which policy they're following at any given time. Now, whenever I encourage people to ask questions, I mean do it in writing and do it in a specific way. And if you want to know what I mean by that, you should check out my video on retaliation that I'll link to at the end of this one. Lesson 2 is think for yourself. Whether you're dealing with one process or two or more, never blindly trust anyone to lead you through it. Even well-meaning employers can steer you wrong, and they're not all well-meaning. Like in my case, EEOC determined that NASA intentionally acted in bad faith. And as much as I'd like to believe my case is special, I doubt it. You should ask your employer for guidance and help. And you always want to work with them in good faith. But always read your employer's policies and think everything through on your own. And whenever your employer tells you something that you don't understand, ask questions until you do. Lesson 3. Base your decisions on the most likely outcome. These processes that we have to deal with, they can be very confusing. And the stakes are very high for us. Our jobs are potentially at stake, and for some of us, our health too. Looking at it in terms of what you truly believe is the most likely outcome can, believe it or not, help you make more rational decisions. For instance, that situation where you're dealing with family medical leave and reasonable accommodation at the same time. I see 3 possible outcomes. 1, family medical leave may be enough for you. You may never need to request reasonable accommodation. And if right now you think a full recovery is very likely in your case, then you can afford to wait to request reasonable accommodation until you're sure you need them. Or you might need reasonable accommodation in addition to family medical leave. And if you think that's the most likely outcome of your situation, then putting off your request for reasonable accommodation might mean that you're not going to get the help you need, and without that help, you could flounder and lose your job. So when you think you're going to need reasonable accommodation, it's a good time to request reasonable accommodation. I wouldn't wait. The third possible outcome is that reasonable accommodation and family medical leave together won't be enough. In that case, you may want to look into applying for disability benefits rather than risk being fired. I will say that if that's the way you decide to go, research it on your own, talk it over with your family and friends, and when you're sure that is the route you want to go, that's when you want to talk it over with your employer. Lesson 4, it's a game. Employers play a lot of games around timelines, essential functions, and a lot of other stuff to try to create the outcomes that they want. I actually fell for one of their games, aimed at getting me to roll back the date on my request for reasonable accommodation so they could use that to justify months of delays. I filed my first request for reasonable accommodation in January, but at my hearing, the diversity manager said the first time she saw a request for me was in March. March wasn't just an arbitrary choice. In fact, between January and March, she tricked me into submitting several revisions to my original request. And every time I submitted one of those revisions, I changed the date on the form. If I had been smarter, I wouldn't have done that. Luckily, that game didn't totally wreck me. But in a slightly different situation, it could have. For instance, if NASA had been able to fire me while I was submitting revisions to my request over and over and over again, it would have been a lot harder for me to prove to EEOC that I was a qualified individual after I was fired, and my disability discrimination claim might have been thrown out as a result. And once that claim was thrown out, a retaliation claim would have been an uphill battle because there might have been no protected activity for me to base it on. And let's take a situation where you're using family medical leave, and you believe your employer wants to fire you. So they might discourage you from filing your request for reasonable accommodation in the first place. And there are any number of creative ways that they might go about that. For example, they might tell you that you can't request reasonable accommodation until you've exhausted your family medical leave. Or they might tell you that you can't request reasonable accommodation until you get a definitive diagnosis from your doctor, or whatever the case may be. Like I said, they're very creative about it. You may think your employer won't lie, and maybe yours won't, but they could still make mistakes that end up harming you. You do want to act in good faith and honestly try to work it out. But while you're doing that, watch your back. Know the policies, gather the evidence, beware the games, and ask the questions. Fight smart and aim in to win.